Welcome to the Nest Summit, part of Climate Week NYC. We are here at the iconic Javits Center. I'm Patricia Wu, host of FinTech TV's sustainability show, The Impact. We are kicking off a week of incredible content on climate change and the growing global fight against this crisis. Let's first start with meeting some of the passionate people who made this event possible. I'd like to introduce Alan Steele, President and CEO of the New York Convention Center Operating Corporation, which operates this magnificent building, the Javits Center, and the founder of the Nest Summit. Also, Britton Jones, founder and CEO of Next Events Media Group, who joined Alan to produce this wonderful event. And also Nest Summit partner, founder and CEO of FinTech TV, Vince Molinari. And finally, joining us from London, Adam Lake from the Climate Group, head of Climate Week. Welcome, everyone. So great to have you guys here.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. So excited to be here.
As we kick off Climate Week, the urgent need for action is underscored by the fires burning in the western United States. It's the worst fire season on record, with millions of acres burned from Washington state to California. After surveying the destruction, California Governor Gavin Newsom says everyone should now see that climate change is irrefutable.
If you do not believe in science, I hope you believe in observed evidence. You walk around this community, you walk around this park around Lake Oroville, you see the reality, a reality that is set in this state in very indelible ways, and that is we're in the midst of a climate emergency. We're in the midst of a climate crisis. We are experiencing weather conditions the likes of which we've never experienced in our lifetime. We're experiencing what so many people predicted decades and decades ago, but all of that now is reality. It's observed. It is part of a consciousness. It's part of the experience, not just the expression that is the state of California.
It is so true. We've been hearing about this for so long. It should come as no surprise that this is what we're seeing now.
There's no question, Patricia, when we look at this, the evidence is so clear. When we used to have a 100-year event, it seems to be weekly, if not more. So it's time for us all to realize the reality of today and take our own action.
Absolutely.
The impact of that is really overwhelming. And I think for a long time, a lot of us thought that climate crisis was something that future generations were going to have to deal with. But the reality is it's here now. We have to deal with it now.
And on a personal level, my own experience is reflected in my daughter's experience. She lives in Healdsburg in California and has now been evacuated 3 times in the last 2 years because of fires. It's there. It's happening.
Yeah.
It's threatening not just my daughter, but my grandkids.
It seems to be happening more and more often, and the fire's getting hotter and hotter. So, I mean, given the urgency of this situation that we are all seeing, and you know from your personal experience, the importance of these events cannot be overestimated. So I'd really like to get an idea of how this all began. So let's start with you, Alan.
Sure. Well, I think it began probably before any idea in my mind that we should produce a summit at the Javits Center, because Climate Week has been taking place in New York now for 12 years. I became chair of the Sustainability Committee at NYC and Company, and we looked to try and advise the hotel, travel, and tourism industry about climate change and what they could do about it in their locations. From that, we were introduced to Adam, and we talked about trying to produce an event. We threw an event together last year in about 3 months. We had a tremendous range of programs about tourism in particular, but also about airline fuels and also about green roofs. So when we'd finished, there was such a level of interest, we decided to do it again this year, but realized pretty quickly that we, as the Javits Center, didn't have the capability of producing an event of the size that was possible. That was when I talked to Britton, who I've known for many years and who I have a lot of respect for as an event producer and a person, and said to him, why don't you take a look at this? And he did, and the rest is now his history.
Wonderful. So we'll let you pick up that part of the story, Britton.
When we first talked, I was so excited and energized by the prospect of working on what Alan had started with the Nest in 2019. When Sharon Enright and I started Next Events Media Group, our mission, our goal was to work on first-class, world-class events that would help make the world a better place. And there's certainly no project, no event that more fits those goals than Climate Week NYC and the Nest Summit at Climate Week NYC. From the very beginning, we wanted to be accretive to the important work that the Adam Lake and the Climate Group were doing, and we wanted to truly collaborate on working on Climate Week NYC. We thought there was an opportunity to increase the inclusiveness of Climate Week NYC, to expand the conversation and heighten the awareness of the need to accelerate climate action now. And so that's when we reached out. There's an area of passion as well. I've been chairman of the board of a food waste organization called Food Rescue US for a number of years. So just so excited to get involved in this. And the first step was reaching out to Adam Lake of the Climate Group and hopefully did find that our interests were clearly aligned.
Wonderful. Yeah, food waste, such an important part of climate change as well. We're all going to be touching on that all week. But I want to get to Adam first. Adam, this is all happening on a global scale, right?
Yeah, it's really is I mean, we see just from the video you showed there how pressing this is. It's interesting. Climate Week NYC, as Alan said, it's 12 years now. And what we've always been very good at, it happens every year alongside the UN General Assembly, is working with heads of state, working with CEOs and presidents of some of the largest businesses in the world. And that always necessitated quite a small closed group style event. But what we've really seen over the past few years, and what's really growing and the most exciting part from my end, is that we're able to have a much more inclusive, diverse, engaging Climate Week with so many events. We've just broken our record this year of how many events are taking place across New York, hundreds and hundreds. And I think that's really important because something that people often say to us is, what can I do? Part of that story is making sure governments and businesses change the big stuff so that there are options. But increasingly, we're wanting to make sure that we work with people across NYC to make sure that they can play their part in taking climate action as well.
Yeah, so important. We can each play a part. And last but not least, Vince, how did you get involved and why is this so important to you as well?
Well, I think at FinTech TV, the impact, we are so humbled and thankful to be part of Climate Week New York City 2020, the Nest Summit. And I think so thankful to Adam for bringing forward the United Nations General Assembly that's typically going on. And I think this relationship of these four groups coming together is the epitome of the Sustainable Development Goal number 17, collaboration and partnership. And how do we work together for the greater good? How do we amplify and accelerate? And that's really the core of what we've been looking to do at FinTech TV and the impact of how do we bring visibility, awareness? How do we make people globally more aware, get outside of the same echo chamber of conversation to create content that resonates, that opens people's heart to take action. So we all take a level of personal responsibility when we see the tragedy of what's happening and understand the connectivity of remote places to us here in the United States, like the Amazon, the lungs of our planet, what that means for carbon reduction, what that impact on weather patterns, what the oceans and what we're doing to our coral reefs and plastics, what the melting of the glaciers mean for all of us, and understand that we're one planet, we're one people, and the way we steward and take personal responsibility for our own actions is only going to help improve and make this planet a better place for all of us.
So true. We are all connected, and what each one of us do impacts all of us. We have to remember that. Thank you. So, Adam, you mentioned that there has been record participation. What do you see going forward? This is so exciting.
I think the fact that we're all here right now, it shows there are two things that are going to get us through the situation that we're in. It's innovation and collaboration. I'm in Ealing Studios. It's the oldest film studio in the world, broadcast into the newest hybrid studio for events to take place. I think it's partnerships, it's participation, working with Next, working with the Javits, NYC and company, who are so connected with all the different organizations around New York City. I think what we've really seen is where you provide opportunities for people to participate, they do. It was very tough a few months ago when we realized we couldn't hold a physical event. But when we found these solutions, you're always a little bit nervous when you're trying something new. But people are knocking our door down to get involved. And I think that's amazing. I think that just goes to show whatever happens in the future, people will want to take part in Climate Week NYC. I think the partnerships represented in the room today will continue. It's going to be really interesting to see how they grow in future years. But the main thing for me, the thing that gets me most excited, is the fact that Climate Week NYC this year, it's not just getting through on contingency, it's going to be the biggest year that we've ever achieved. And it's thanks to the participation and collaboration and support from others that has allowed us to do that.
So important, and it's so heartwarming to know that there are more and more people participating, which shows us that more and more people know that this is a problem that needs to be tackled now.
Absolutely, and I think that, it's interesting. Climate change used to be a single issue that people were interested in. I think what people understand now, especially with the SDGs, climate change is an issue that affects so many different parts of your life. It's the environment around you, it's the job that you have, it's the family you live with and their future too. So there are many opportunities for people to engage on areas very, very close to their heart. And I think that's a development that's really boosted that support that we've seen in recent years.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Adam.
I just wanted to add that from the very beginning, this collaboration on the Nest Summit seemed like something that was absolutely meant to be. From the very first conversation with Alan, the fact that the Javits Center became a hospital during the pandemic and now is one of the largest broadcast studios in New York, very fortuitous. The collaboration with Adam has just been so tremendous. And then to find Vince and the team at FinTech TV and the impact, none of this could have happened individually, but it's the interdependentness and how we all came together to make this happen. It's so tremendously exciting. And the fact that we pulled all this together, a program of such substance and meaning, in such short order, it really came together in about 5 or 6 weeks. And it makes me tremendously excited for 2021, when we all have a year to work together, and hopefully in both a virtual and an in-person event here under the largest green roof in New York.
Yeah, absolutely. If you want to go far, go together.
Absolutely. Well said.
Thank you so much. It's been such a privilege and a pleasure.
Thank you, Patricia.
Thank you, Patricia. It's been our pleasure.
We will have coverage all week long, and you can check it out at climateweeknyc.org, thenestsummit.com, and fintech.tv.
everyone, my name is KAVITA GUPTA. Welcome to NEST Summit for Climate Week 2020 from Javits Center. This week we have been talking about how to basically from generational impacts to impacts investments, green bonds, moving billions into the space, and how to have an accelerated impact. How can we not talk and actually learn from the person who moved the climate change and the climate activism to the national level during his run? Tom Steyer. Tom is an American hedge fund manager, philanthropist, and most importantly, an environmentalist. He's the founder and former co-senior managing partner of Federated Capital and the co-founder of Beneficial State Bank. He came to national prominence with his Democratic presidential nomination run, which he used to bring climate change as the national agenda.
I've got 4 kids between the ages of 26 and 31. I cannot allow this country to go down the path of climate destruction. Everybody in their generation knows it. We cannot put climate on the back seat all the time and say, we're going to sign this one more deal, we're going to do one more thing without putting climate first. That's why it's my #1 priority. We can do it in a way that makes us richer, but we have to do it.
Tom, it's such a pleasure to have you here. I mean, I know your work, I know you, your family for so long, but what you did with the presidential run, bringing climate change to everyone's attention, was commendable. Thank you so much for taking time out for us today.
KAVITA, it's a treat to be with you.
So you started your journey in the hedge fund world, first with Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs, and then your own fund. And you have invested in the past in fossil fuels, but you since have emerged as one of the most vocal supporters of change. What triggered this, and how did you really started moving such a big capital into ESG lenses?
Well, KAVITA, you're going back in some of those things 40 years.
Yeah.
And so 40 years ago, I wasn't at all aware about climate change. I really became aware of it sitting around the kitchen table in our house, talking to our kids about what the future looked like and what we as a society needed to do really to have a just and prosperous future. And we realized about 15 years ago, oh my goodness gracious, our society's not dealing with climate. And I became involved, really trying to figure out what was necessary and how I could help be part of the movement to take this from being a problem and a crisis to being an American success. And I thought at first it was about technology, that we didn't have the clean energy technology to accomplish what we needed to do. And then I thought it was about information and persuasion, that people didn't understand what was going on. It really was only about 10 years ago that I realized, oh no, this is a political problem. And when that happened, I started to get involved specifically politically to run campaigns around it. I quit my job in the private sector. I divested from fossil fuel investments, and I've devoted myself full time in the last 8 years to doing what my kids and I were talking about 15 years ago, which is trying to create a just and also a sustainable world for them, for the people today, but for them in the future, and for all Americans in the future. That's, and I realized I came to the conclusion about how to deal with it gradually, having come to the realization that we all need to come together to deal with it before that.
That's like a long, long journey, and like you have built like the building blocks on top of it. But how was it when you walked into your capital and said, okay, we're going to start divesting? Like, how did that process go? Because it must be a shock to a lot of people in the office.
I had to leave.
Oh.
Honestly, KAVITA, for me to fully engage in terms of climate, environmental justice, economic justice, racial justice, I really didn't feel that I could be a professional investor anymore. I specifically had to get rid of all of my personal relationship from an investing standpoint to fossil fuels. Wow. I think that that was something I could not have any commitment or relationship with what I thought of as part of the, the basic reason that we're in this crisis. I will also point out, as somebody who was a professional investor for more than 30 years, that
I believed at the time and continue to believe that investing in disappearing industries is not smart. That in fact, if you look in 2020, this year, the disproportionate number of non-performing loans in American banks like Wells Fargo and it relate to fossil fuel investments. So I think it's important for all of us to commit to a clean energy future, because that's the right thing to do and it will solve our climate issues. But in addition, I think it's the smart thing to do, both in terms of investment and also in terms of job creation.
You just talked about job creation. You are now, has been tapped in to be the co-chair for Governor's Task Force in California on business and jobs recovery for COVID response. And you have always talked about creating more and more jobs using clean energy. How is that going and what's your vision about it?
Well, I think that, the pandemic has caused a very sharp slowdown in economic activity in California and across the United States, and a real drop in employment. And at the same time in California, we've been experiencing by far the biggest and most destructive wildfire season that California has ever seen. We've had the highest temperatures in California history, including the highest recorded temperature anywhere on the globe ever this summer in Death Valley. So we're in a situation where it's all coming together, where we have a crisis in terms of environmental justice and climate, where we have to, in every sector of our economy, respond to that and to move to clean energy. And that also is a means for addressing our unemployment issues, because it's going to mean putting, hundreds of thousands of people in California and millions of people across America to work.
Yeah. California still have fracking issues. What, as a person who knows Governor very well, who is working towards policy changes, what has been your stand on it?
Look, I've been pushing to move away from fossil fuels as fast as we possibly can. Mm-hmm. And, in every instance, whether it's electricity generation, moving to wind and solar and batteries and hydro, or whether it is in moving to zero emission vehicles as fast as possible, rebuilding the built environment to make buildings much more energy efficient, or new forms of manufacturing and regenerative agriculture. Those are all things that I have been advising on and pushing for in this task force, but much more broadly, that I've been pushing for society-wide America, across America and across the world for, well over a decade.
Yeah. Tom, you had to leave, you had to burn your relationships when you decided you are going in this direction. Today, there are so many public equity vehicles which are available. If a family office or if a new hedge funds today want to be completely under ESG lens, are there any recommendations or suggestions you would have for them?
I don't have any specific fund or index that I would recommend to people. When I started doing this, I was really at the front end. And so we went out and wrote our own rules about what we would allow people who are investing for us to do. And so, I think at this point, there are lots, as you said, of options for making fossil fuel free investments. But you referenced earlier, KAVITA, Beneficial State Bank, the bank that Kat Taylor and I started about 15 years ago, which is a triple bottom line bank dedicated to being sustainable economically, working for economic justice, working for a green, sustainable economy, and specifically trying to support businesses owned and run by women and people of color. And so, there's a place where, it's not just not doing the things that are contributing to our energy crisis, our climate crisis, or our crisis around racial economic and environmental justice, but actually trying to support and encourage and empower the opposite, the good forces, the clean forces, the moves towards economic justice and fairness that we really need as a society to embrace. And so it's not just a question of not doing things, it's to understand that we have a huge opportunity in front of us to rebuild the infrastructure and the kind of guts of America, and that we're all going to have to participate that in a variety of ways. And for people who are investors, you know, there are going to be gigantic opportunities to really participate in producing a sustainable and equitable society.
Absolutely. I have a fun question for you now. If you are asked to work with the current White House, what will be your 3 top suggestions?
Which I won't be, KAVITA.
Well, let's say you decide to be an insider and actually make some changes, hope positive changes finally, from this White House. What would you have anything like you think you can make those changes?
Yeah,
or
look,
recommendations?
the first thing I'd say is you're going to have to make sustainability and environmental justice a priority. You know, this is not something that you can put at the bottom of your list, both domestically and internationally. If you expect to deal successfully with our climate and environmental justice crises, you have to put it as a top priority. That's the first point. And of course, that's 180 degrees away from where this administration is. Second point is, this is not marginal changes. We're talking about being bold, you know, both in terms of how we run our society and how we lead the world and participate with other countries in terms of changing the way that energy is generated and used. And so those are and that's another place where this administration is very far from, you know, where my suggestions, at 180 degrees right. And the last thing is this: you can't look at these questions about sustainability, clean energy, environmental justice as a siloed issue to be addressed specifically. It has to be put in a broader context. It has to be put in a broader context about equity, racial justice, economic justice, job creation, where the jobs are good paying, middle-class jobs through organized labor. And so the last thing I'd say is, don't silo this. Don't think that you can just go and make a couple of statements or undo a couple of the mistakes you've made and now claim to have dealt with the problem and be a sincere environmentalist. This is something that requires a broad, comprehensive program that connects environmental justice and racial justice and economic justice and job creation in a very broad way, because the issue itself is so built into the guts of American society. And therefore, if you do that, prioritize it, are bold in your solutions, and look at it comprehensively, then you're actually going to be in a place where you can deal with a historic issue, a historic threat to the health and safety of everybody in our country, of every single American, in a way that we all could be proud of.
Yeah. Everything what you said and everything the signal this White House has given seems 180-degree opposite. I completely agree with you.
Well, the good news is they're not going to ask me, and if they did ask me, they wouldn't listen to me.
I wish they would, though. This should be forefront. So what about the Green New Deal? Like, what's your view on it?
Look, I think the Green New Deal does everything that I just said. You know, it prioritizes the issues. It is broad and comprehensive, and it's bold. So it's the kind of solution we're talking about. And I think the other thing that you've got to give an enormous amount of credit to in terms of the Green New Deal is how it has galvanized people across the country, how it has galvanized young people very specifically, how it's been led by young people. You can see it in terms of turnout. We saw it in Massachusetts in terms of the, you know, overwhelming record turnout in a Democratic primary for the senator who was the co-sponsor of the Green New Deal. Record turnout by young people with, support from young people in the Sunrise Movement. And so as somebody who's been involved in terms of climate and environmental justice for a long time, I'm incredibly supportive and enthusiastic of the Green New Deal and what it stands for, and also what it implies about the new generation, people between 18 and 35, that's normally considered young voters, really stepping up, establishing their voice, establishing their leadership, and really taking this country to a place where I believe we have to be, which is a transformative new way of thinking about environmental justice and climate justice and economic justice, all in one big package and moving us all there.
How long do you think it's actually, will it ever pass, and will it be like a federal policy? Do you think, what is it going to take to make it one?
Well, Kevin, if you've looked at Joe Biden's climate plan, it is very progressive. It is very aggressive. It does take that comprehensive look where it's not just a climate plan dealing with the climate emergency, but also deeply steeped in environmental justice in the underserved Black and brown communities where toxins and pollutions are concentrated, deeply connected with the labor movement and the need to respect the dignity of working people and working families, and making sure that we are creating over 10 million jobs through this plan, but ones that are going to be middle-class, good-paying union jobs. And so I think it's very realistic in terms of what we can get done, particularly if progressives, and absolutely essentially, if progressives do well on November 3rd, 2020. So when do I think this can happen? I think look, we're in an emergency. I live in Northern California. We are seeing we are living climate change through record heat waves, record fires, record air pollution where the sun has been blotted out. So do I believe that this can happen very early and must happen very early in a Biden administration supported by the Senate and the House of Representatives? I absolutely believe that's realistic. I absolutely believe it's necessary. And I think we have a very short period of time to get done the guts of what we need to do in a broad way, and then go to the rest of the world and say, we're back, we're committed, and we want you to be committed with us so that we can solve this together.
Yeah. I think one thing which I want to underline out of everything you said is November 3rd, 2020. I mean, everybody should vote, and everybody should vote for climate at least. You also do, through different foundations, different initiatives, a lot of grassroots level work. I read one of the slogans on your website, saving the environment means fighting racism. I would love to have more elaboration on it. Like, it's a beautiful slogan. It really did move me.
Well, I've always believed, and all of my experience confirms, that there is no way to have a successful climate policy without starting with environmental justice, without starting with the people and the communities, underserved Black and brown and indigenous communities across America, where this society has concentrated its air pollution, its water pollution, and its toxins. And that unless the policy addresses the systemic unfairness of this system that exists, who gets sick from drinking the tap water? Who gets asthma from breathing the air? Who dies early because of the toxins in their immediate environment? Unless you start with those communities, with leadership and policy guidance from those communities, you're not going to have the right policies, and you're not going to have anything happen. And so for as long as I've been involved politically with climate and environmental justice, it's been in partnership with people from those communities, supporting people from those communities, and making sure that their ideas and voices are at the very forefront. And so it is impossible to me that we are going to come up with a successful climate program that isn't centered and founded around the ideas of environmental justice and redressing systemic wrongs of the most serious health impacts that exist in our society. And, you know, that's how you do what's right. That's how you do what's successful. And honestly, that's going to be, I believe, the moral tenor and the moral leadership that's going to put us in a position to lead the world.
Yeah. Very well said, Tom. Tom, I remember COP21. You were one of the biggest forces from US to get the pact together. You hosted more than 12 or 15 policy meetings, dinners, getting people together. Oh my God, you were such a force. And today, US is not the part of the pact. Like, I mean, it's been going on for the last couple of years. Do we have a solution? Is there a way for us to be back?
Well, I think we're going to need new leadership in the United States if we're going to be international leaders on climate or environmental justice, or really anything else. I think it's quite clear that we are no longer, it's not just that we're not leaders, we're really not members of the international community. So I think it's going to be necessary to have a new administration.
Yeah.
I think we're going to have accomplished domestic legislative things and executive actions that show where our values are, where our hearts are, and that we're deadly serious. And then I think people around the world are anxious for Americans to step up and take the role that we've played for a very long time in terms of standing for what's right, standing for all the values that America stands for around the world. And I think that that's going to be a necessary ingredient for a coalition around the world to come together and solve our climate crisis. And so I think it's absolutely 85% of the CO2 emissions come from outside the United States. If we're perfect and nobody goes along with us, then this crisis is never going to be solved. So we have to do it internally. We have to have credibility internationally, but we have to do it together with the other nations of the world. And we have to understand that it's going to be as partners, cooperating together, sharing technology, and basically reinforcing each other's ability and will to get done what we all have to get done.
No, I absolutely agree with you. And I'm like somewhere still in shock that it's been happening. But I really, really hope this changes because we, as you said, forget about leadership. We don't even feel like a member of this. I can't continue this conversation without talking about your amazing, inspirational wife. Like, I absolutely love her. You and Kat has beautiful ranch outside San Francisco, and you guys have amazing regenerative agricultural part and a lot of amazing activities happening there. Share something with us, share some initiatives, because I've seen some firsthand, and it's always been super powerful.
Kat Taylor has been involved with regenerative agriculture for a long time. And I think that she's been committed to the idea of healthy soils, of healthy agricultural practices, healthy food, and a regeneration of the land and a sequestering of carbon in the soil. And so our ranch has really been a scientific experiment by her to show that you can raise healthy animals, that you can restore the soil, and that it can actually be a net carbon sequestration from soup to nuts. And so getting regenerative agricultural, both for the sake of healthy diets for American citizens, and also as a way of sequestering carbon and partially addressing our climate crisis, but also dealing with the health of the soils and the more traditional parts of agriculture has been something that she's worked on and thought about and led on for a very long time. And I think that it's impossible to look at American society and not realize that we have real issues about health and food, and we have real issues about soil health. And I think that farmers are anxious to do the right thing, anxious to make sure that they have sustainable natural environments, anxious to participate in solving our climate crisis, but we have to put into place
practices and policies that support them in that and that enable them to do that in a profitable way and let them live out, the ideals that they really bring in the first place. But, they're living in a very competitive and difficult economic environment, raising crops. And so the policies have got to support them in that and also support, dealing with our climate crisis.
Wow. So, and I know all your kids, they are also very passionate about climate and helping from grassroots to all the way from the fund. So what does this Steyer legacy looks like, It's such an amazing family, coming together.
KAVITA, I was at the memorial service for somebody who I admire a lot, who had done an amazing job, both in terms of starting businesses and being a international environmentalist. And at the memorial service, one of his close friends stood up to basically talk about how much positive impact he'd had in his life. And he said, if you can accomplish your life's work while you're alive, think bigger. And so when you ask me about legacy, my goal in this is to be a link in the chain, to be one of the people who's pushing for a more just and equitable world, who's pushing for the rights of human beings, who's pushing for a sustainable planet to preserve God's planet and to step up for the most vulnerable amongst us. And those are fights that have gone on long before I was born, and they're going to continue long after I'm gone. But I want people to think that when the chips were down, and they're definitely, all the chips are on the table right now, that I was on the side of, the right and trying to push to support people, to support the planet, and to try and make sure that in the future people had the ability to lead the kind of life that America has been promising really since our inception, but actually to deliver that kind of equity, that kind of justice, and that kind of broad-based prosperity.
Wow, very beautifully said. I can literally feel your words, Tom. My last question to you, Tom. What would be, during this climate week, one biggest message to the whole world, just not for US citizens, but everyone who is watching across the world, a call for action, a message which you want to leave them with?
Look, I think what people have to recognize, and the message of this year and this summer, is we don't have a day to waste. It's not something we have to get to. It's not something we have to discuss and talk about. It's overdue. We have to make up for lost time at this point because we're in a crisis and an emergency. And the idea that we can be deliberative about this is not true. If you look at the science, and COVID brings home that if you want to deal with a scientific issue, deal with the data and the facts. The data and the facts say we have no time to waste. We are in a sprint using the intelligence and will of human beings around the planet. We're in a sprint against the forces of nature that we've unleashed that threaten the health and safety of everybody on the planet. And we do not have a single second to waste to try and put ourselves in a place where we can have a prosperous, we can have a healthy and safe future, and we can avoid almost unimaginable human suffering, and something that it's almost too much to contemplate. It is something we would be horrified to accomplish, and that we can absolutely avert if we come together and do what we all know is necessary.
Very well said. And I have a surprise question for you before we let you go. A youth activist, Alexandria Villasenor, who also spoke at DNC all about climate activism, had a question for you. And we're going to play the video from her, and I'm very excited to see what she has for you.
Hi, Tom. Recently, we've seen the entire West Coast go up in flames. And while these fires are fueled by climate change, our outdated infrastructure and poor forest management have also made these fires worse. Part of your campaign was climate resilient infrastructure. and I was wondering if you could tell us more about what this would look like in the future.
So it's absolutely true that our practices around forestry have exacerbated the extent of our fires. And there are lots of things that we can do in terms of the way that we manage forests, in the way that we manage underbrush around buildings, to minimize the impact of what's going on in terms of fires across the West. But let me say this. Those fires are a direct response to heat waves that are the hottest in history. They're a direct response to a fire season where we have extreme fire risks for an additional 2 months. We have multiples of acres that are now at extreme risk. I think 9 times as many acres are at extreme fire risk. So there are ways for us to adapt to this more thoughtfully and more effectively, and we should absolutely pursue that kind of adaptation and be smart about it. But there's no way that that kind of adaptation can solve the underlying problem, just as adaptation is not going to solve our climate crisis. Ultimately, if you look at the kind of heat that we're having, we had the highest recorded heat ever on the planet this summer in California. Phoenix has, in 2018, had 128 days in Phoenix, Arizona, over 100 degrees. Human beings can't adapt to the kind of heat that we're going to see around the world unless we deal with our climate crisis in terms of its causes. And so, should we adapt? We absolutely have to adapt. We will adapt. We're going to have to do that on a near-term, immediate crisis basis. But long-term, the idea that we can adapt to what scientists are telling us will happen if we don't get off our fossil fuel addiction, if we don't get back on a sustainable path, is something that human beings, we adapt very slowly to changes in nature. And the pace with which this is happening is not something that we can adapt to over time. We've got to change the course of what's going on now, and we've got to come together to change that. And of course, we'll use the smart adaptation, but ultimately, we're going to have to get back on a sustainable course that's healthy, that takes care of people, and that's equitable.
Wow. So we are in an emergency situation. The need is now. It's urgent. And if we don't make any changes in a positive direction, the chances of our survival are very, very few. I mean, that's my biggest takeaway from this conversation. And I'm not going to see you in the current White House. Those are the 2 takeaways.
Let me tell you one other thing, though, if I could, KAVITA.
Yes, please.
Human ingenuity is incredible. We're on a worse path in the natural world than people ever expected. But our ability to deal with it, our engineering and technological breakthroughs have been faster and more important than anyone expected either. So yes, we're in an emergency situation. Yes, we have to act, immediately and forcefully, but our ability to do that in a way that will be actually net job creating, will create more equity and a healthier society exists too. So yes, we have to do it, but our ability to do it is greater than it's ever been and better than people expected.
Thank you, Tom, with those amazing last words. Thank you so much for taking time out. Thank you so much for helping us with the Climate Week to understand the urgency of this situation. And stay safe in California, and please give our love to Kat.
Thank you very much, KAVITA.
Good morning and welcome to Climate Change and Shareholder Engagement. Our session today is with Bruce Duguid. He is Head of Stewardship at EOS Equity Ownership for Federated Hermes. Bruce, welcome to the show today. Thank you so much for coming. So we're here today to talk about climate change and shareholder engagement. And the big question for most of our clients when we speak to them is, why should we own a company that is emitting versus just divesting from it? Can you give us some clarity around how Federated Hermes works with shareholder engagement on those issues?
Yeah, certainly. And that's certainly a big question. And let me explain a little bit the background to the work that we do and why we think this is the right way to go when companies are exposed to big issues like climate change. So at Federated Hermes, we have a long history of doing stewardship work. And this goes back to our roots, where we were the in-house asset manager for the largest corporate pension scheme in the UK, the British Telecom Pension Scheme. And so we took a long-term approach to our investments, and that meant looking after and engaging carefully with the companies that we've invested in. And we've been doing this for 30 years, but we then started to take on clients as third-party clients who would join us in this endeavour. And that way we could then have a much larger and better resource team than any single client or organisation would be able to have on its own. And so in recent times, we've been increasing the size of that team as we've increased our asset base. We now represent over $1 trillion of assets, and we have a team that is now over 60 professionals doing this important work. And we've been around at some of the big events, for example, the founding of the Principles for Responsible Investment and the initiation of the Climate Action 100 Collaborative Shareholder Initiative. So that's a little bit about the background. Now, shall I turn to your point about why we would continue to invest and engage with companies exposed to climate change?
Yes, please, absolutely.
So I mean, I think the first thing to say is that nearly all companies have an exposure to climate change because our economy is still not yet net zero. So this is the real world that we need to deal with. And the world is committed at the highest level to a transition to ultimately zero emissions. So this is a shared endeavour that we all need to be involved in, and you can't really avoid it by just picking and choosing certain types of investment. And engagement is the process by which we take companies over that journey. And we do this in a way that is supportive, collaborative, because we're working for the same goals in the end. This is the outcome of lower carbon emissions for the whole of the economy, but also the successful preservation and creation of value at companies. And so we need to partner with companies and explain the type of changes and support them through this transition. And that is essentially what stewardship is really about.
And you find that companies respond better to engagement and stewardship versus divestment?
Yeah, so certainly companies always want to keep their shareholders, and they want to ultimately they exist in order to deliver value to shareholders as well as wider society. And so divestment is never the route that a company wants to see. And it's also not really what investors want to see, because we want to have the opportunity to choose a broad portfolio of investments on behalf of our clients. Now, when it comes to, I want to go into engagement and explain how I think it works. But maybe I should just say a little bit about divestment and how it doesn't work in most cases. Because if you divest from a company, if any investor divests, then you've lost that natural shareholder right to influence the company, to recommend and make votes at the shareholder meetings each year. And so the company, unless it's actually in fundraising mode, which hardly any large companies are, especially the more fossil fuel related, they'll be paying dividends back to their investors rather than, or buying shares rather than taking investment. then you're not affecting the capital and the real decisions of the company by divesting. So that's the big disadvantage. I think the time when divestment can make sense is where there is a strong belief that the company has no value creation pathway to a sustainable business model. And you could take that view based on investment beliefs, and you could take that view either at the sector level or at company by company level. And so it can be rational to take the view, say, of heavily coal exposed companies to no longer engage because there isn't a value pathway that can work.
So Bruce, is engagement on climate change working today?
Absolutely, it works. I think that at the moment, investors are the single biggest force at work in the economy, making change happen at companies. And the reason for this is that companies have received the very high-level societal signal that the world needs to decarbonize. You see that articulated in the Paris Agreement on climate change and in target setting by individual nations, net zero now in Europe, indications the US will ultimately go in that direction as well. But this high-level signal is then not matched by supportive policy. And yet investors take that long-term approach. They look over the horizon of the short term and can see the ultimate need and inevitability of this transition. And so we're the ones who are putting the pressure on companies to say, you need to now get your transition plan working. And we've seen this happen in a number of places. So the first area I'd highlight is oil and gas, where now a range of the oil majors have committed to net zero emissions as their corporate ambition and are now setting pathways to achieve that. So BP, for example, has indicated the reduction in emissions by 2030 it expects to achieve, and a reduction in oil and gas output of perhaps around 40% by 2030, while it increases its investment in renewables. You see other European majors in a similar category. Utilities making big progress. Duke Energy, one of the US's largest emitters, now has a net zero target and is putting in place its pathway to decarbonize. Dominion Energy also similarly has a big shift. And the auto players, you've got the remarkable situation of Tesla, the pure electric car maker, now having a market cap that is higher than the other big automakers in the US, GM, Ford, and Fiat Chrysler, and also higher than any other car company last time I looked. So, you know, this shift in value that is following those decarbonisation strategies is really very clear to see. So a lot of this has come through investor pressure, and this is how we can see the changes taking place. And we've published a number of case studies that show how our engagement has made a change at companies, which we'd be happy to steer people towards.
So across the world today, we're dealing with all kinds of physical climate risks. Do you think that's adding help or fuel to the engagement process? And what do you think is up and coming in the next year on climate change stewardship due to all of the issues that we're seeing in the world today?
Yeah, I think that the constant visible reminder of climate change is helping to keep up the momentum. It's not the way we'd like it to be, but I think it's inevitable that this will happen as we get more frequent and intense weather events and associated environmental change. I think the wildfires have been a particularly visible way of seeing this, and you know, California, of course, but Australia dramatically changed the perception in Australia on climate change, which has got quite a polarized debate, just about 50-50 in favour and against faster transition. So this will continue to happen. And I think that what we will look forward to is a continuing tailwind of policy rising and ratcheting, and it may come unexpectedly. So if you look at the events around the tragic death of George Floyd, you can see an issue suddenly turn very quickly. And we saw similar thing happen in the UK with a campaign called Extinction Rebellion, which has helped to shift the government here into net zero emissions as its target. And so I think we could see rapid change take place in the policy landscape.
So I'd like to bring in Mark Sherlock. He's head of U.S. equities at Federated Hermes. So Mark, do companies actually listen to you? Can you give me some examples of what's actually working out in the marketplace?
Sure, thanks, Jeff, and thanks for having me along today. As you mentioned, I come at it from this issue of perspective of investor, and I think that we really must keep investing in CO2 emitting companies if we are to affect change. Specifically on your point, we've been engaged in businesses for very many years now and have a huge number of successful engagement outcomes that we're very proud of. Specifically, you ask for an example. I think perhaps one of the most controversial examples is Alliant Energy, which we've held for a number of years in the portfolio, and indeed was the worst emitter of CO2 in our portfolio. At the time at which we started engaging with the business, the reason that it scored so badly was that 40% power generation came from coal-based production. Over the course of time, we are long-term investors. These are multi-year engagement agendas. We've managed to, in conjunction with the company itself, convince them to commit to reducing that, and indeed they've made significant strides already. So from a base of 45% coal-based generation, we're now down to 25% coal-based generation. Conversely, renewables generation up from 5% to nearer 35%. Now, this represents several $1 billion worth of investment. The achieved from renewables is directly tied to the CEO's bonus. So it's a neat example of CO2 emissions down, profitability up as the company decouples from inefficient coal plants and switches production towards much more efficient and renewable sources, and ultimately creates a win-win both for the investor and for those seeking improvements in climate change.
And lastly, Mark, you have all different companies reporting differently around their carbon emissions. How do you rationalize that or balance that from company to company when you're doing engagement?
It's a great question because, as you say, the data set that we're dealing with is often incomplete. I look specifically at the small and mid-cap end of the market, so in simple terms, companies that are not in the S&P 500, and there is huge variability in the disclosure that those companies are able to provide. I mean, most obviously, it skews by size, so the larger the company, the greater the resources they have in order to make disclosures. But it also varies by industry. Most obviously, utilities have a legal obligation to disclose a lot more than some other types of business. It can also be affected by the state that the company is resident in. And of course, all this data is ultimately backward-looking. So it's a very complex situation. The way we approach it is to look at that data with some skepticism. Really, I think it's about knowing the companies that you own. As I say, being long-term investors, we have significant relationships with these businesses. discussing the issues that affect them with regards to climate change and where they might focus their energy. So if they have limited resources, they get the biggest bang for their buck. As I say, it's really about knowing your businesses, engaging with them, and trying to encourage them to think about and action things that will help to combat climate change.
Bruce, we're talking about carbon emissions, and that's in relationship to stranded assets and carbon tax, which obviously in Europe they're dealing with already. But what about the act of physical risk itself? Is Federated Hermes starting to look at TCFD adherence and looking at whether companies are actually prepared for a world that has 2-degree warming or more, and what those physical risks might be to those companies? And does that factor into your due diligence process today?
Yeah, the physical risk profile of companies to climate change is a really important question, and it's one of the questions that we ask companies in our engagement. We ask them to look at different scenarios of climate change. Now, the low carbon scenario tends to be one focused on lower physical risk, but more policy transition risk. But the high carbon scenarios are the ones where you're going to see the bigger physical challenges. And we're talking things like flooding, but also hurricanes, high storm events, and just heat transition, which has caused trouble with technology providers, internet facilities not working in times of high heat, and other facilities not functioning as you would expect. And we actually at Federated Hermes, we have an asset locator piece of software which enables us to see assets that are in different locations at companies and how exposed they are to, for example, water stress or to flood risk. And that enables us to pinpoint our engagement that much better. So I think that we'll see more sophisticated use by investors of data feeds that are very specific to individual companies and the physical exposure risks that they have to climate change. And that will become an even greater source of discrimination between good and less good investment opportunities.
I really want to thank Bruce and Mark for joining us today. Federated Hermes is leading the way on shareholder engagement, and we greatly appreciate the work that you guys are doing around climate risk and climate change. So thank you both very much.
Hi, I'm Vince Molinari, and welcome to The Nest, part of Climate Week New York City. And we have a spectacular guest. I'd love to tell you all about it. We'll jump in. All the great movement that ICE, the New York Stock Exchange, is doing. We have the pleasure of having Lynn Martin, who's the President and Chief Operating Officer of ICE Data Services, with us. Lynn, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Vince. We're thrilled to be able to participate this year.
Well, look, if you could frame it up for us, I think many people around the world have heard of the New York Stock Exchange, know of it as being a leading and innovator and one of the biggest capital markets in the world. Many aren't familiar with the Intercontinental Exchange. Maybe you can explain that relationship.
Yeah, I'd be happy to, Vince. So, Intercontinental Exchange, also known as ICE, the way you should think of us is really an operator of networks. What I mean by that is we are a variety of global exchanges and global clearinghouses, which are nodes on that network. But importantly, through that network, there is a tremendous amount of market insights, which is the data services business that I have the privilege of running. New York Stock Exchange, as you point out, is probably one of our most notable exchanges, being the leader and innovator, particularly in the U.S. capital markets. But we are the home of global energy markets, global interest rate markets, global equity indices, as well as a broad spectrum of data services. And finally, we've just recently added our mortgage services business with the acquisition of the Ellie Mae business, which just closed a couple of weeks ago.
Congratulations on that, and I have to bring forward the New York Stock Exchange being a member of the United Nations Sustainable Stock Exchange Initiative, being, again, in that leadership position, so thank you for that. And I'll tell you that...
Well, it's something that we believe in, so we're thrilled to do it.
Great. And that framing of thinking about ICE as that network and the nodes and really that connectivity and really the outcomes of the data streams that come from all that connectivity really gives us a full appreciation. Lynn, I wanted to jump in. There's been, from governments to market participants, a number of different initiatives that have gone on. How do we attack some of the climate issues? Mixed results. Lots going on at the ICE itself with NYSE. Can you speak to us about some of that right now?
Yeah, and that question is super timely, as just this morning I saw that the European Commission brought forward some of their targets and raised their targets for emissions reduction by 2030 to 55% versus where it was previously. So it's such a timely question. When you think about the way markets and government mandates influence markets, there's got to be a marrying together of the aspirations of the government, the aspirations of market participants, and then the information that is available to help folks manage risk in markets. At ICE, our core mission is to really drive transparency. And when it comes to issues such as climate risk, transparency can have many different levels. As I mentioned, the business that I run, ICE Data Services, our focus is first in developing products that help folks understand what climate risks are in the market, because it's great for us to be talking about global warming, super active hurricane season, wildfires in San Francisco and the rest of the West Coast. But if you can't marry that together with actionable insights, it's really challenging for a market participant to assess the effects of climate change on markets. The other area when we talk about transparency are some of the nodes I mentioned earlier, our listed markets. And what most folks don't realize is that we have been a market leader in carbon reduction trading since we acquired the Chicago Climate Exchange back in 2010. As I stand here today, more than 50 million tons of carbon trades through the ICE network on any given day. So that's 13 billion tons over the course of a year. When you marry that together with our global natural gas complex, we're the market leaders there. We've got the TTF benchmark, which is quickly emerging as the global benchmark, the JKM benchmark out in Asia, and the US natural gas markets. You can see that we're really an ecosystem which is helping to drive change both from a transparency perspective on the data side, but also allowing folks to very accurately express risk management opinions in our markets around the effects of climate change and the modernization of the energy ecosystem.
Well, there was so much within that, Lynn, and I just have to touch on some of those key points when you talk about transparency, when you talk about risk. And it's great to have the conversation around climate. What do we do about it? But without the data points, without the pieces to engineer product, right? Product that has muscle memory that we may be very familiar with, but now has new wrappers associated with this evolution of ESG. Could you talk a little bit more about where you see the trends going, what ICE is doing within those trends?
Yeah, specifically when it comes to climate risk in particular, one of the areas we're really focused on is what I talked about, transparency. Climate data is a very messy data set. Effects of hurricanes, wildfires, wind speed, heat, those different metrics. And it really is what led us to have a conversation with a fintech provider called Risk about 2 years ago to see how we can help bring to market a data set that looks at the effects of climate change and really what the impacts are in the market. So you fast forward to, I guess, January of this year, we announced an initiative which we're calling ICE Climate Risk. What that does is it takes our market-leading valuations data associated with the U.S. municipality market, as you well know, municipalities issue debt to finance their operations, both at the state and local levels. Also hospitals, schools issue debt to fund their operations. But importantly, the ability for those municipalities and jurisdictions to repay their debt is actually affected by climate change. Taking a real-life example, as I'm sadly standing here talking to you today, is the issue of the wildfires going on the West Coast. This FinTech partner that we've worked with has geospatial data measured in 100-meter increments. And because we have the treasure trove of data that we do on the financial side of the business, we're able to marry together individual municipal securities alongside what their climate risk score. For the West Coast, you're able to see that certain jurisdictions, certain municipalities are trading at the same levels in the market, despite the fact that certain municipalities have wildfire risk, others have less wildfire risk. So what do you think that actually means for those securities that are trading in the market? Should one be trading at a differential to the other to more accurately affect that risk? Similarly for Florida and the Gulf Coast, on the eve of yet another hurricane looking to hit the Gulf Coast, Superstorm Sally, what's the effect on it's going to be their ability to repay debt and finance hospital operations, things of that nature. Because we're able to stitch this all together, the fixed income trader in the market can now actually see on a security by security basis the effects of potential climate risk when they're making those trading decisions every day in the markets.
Well, and I think that's so spot on as we think more and more. What is the relationship of climate risk, our capital markets, our pricing, and to the extent that you brought that out, what should be at a premium because it has very low exposure? What should be perhaps at a discount because they have untold, perhaps, of unforeseen amounts of what was previously thought to be off balance sheet risk? So
absolutely, and it's not our job to offer an opinion there. Our job is to just show the data to the market in an understandable, accurate form that allows people to make more informed risk management decisions.
All about increasing the tools in the toolkit.
That's right.
So let's talk a little bit about standardization. We've seen lots of things going on. That standardization best practice, we all need that, right, to be able to measure what are we measuring, what are we comparing to, what are we pricing to. I know ICE has responded to this in several ways. Can you dive into that a little bit without giving away too much secret sauce?
Yeah, absolutely. When you're looking at issues that really are focused around environmental, social, and governance, you have two problems in the market today. I talked about initially how messy the data is. It's not in structured format. It's not something that is relatable to what an investor would typically consume to make risk management decisions. But also the disclosures that are out there there's a wide variety of disclosures out there. So it becomes a little bit difficult for an investor at the moment to make heads or tails without relying on someone else's opinion as to what risks they really want to measure against. Some people may feel more strongly about a firm's greenhouse gas emission score. Some folks might feel strongly, again, within the same realm, talking about good board governance and diversity representation and pay equity and those sorts of issues. We announced a partnership earlier this year with Bank of America where we're just going to focus on collecting as much publicly available data that companies and municipalities and local governments put out and turn that into what we're calling a reference data service. The way I like to phrase it, we're actually showing firms their ESG footprint in the market. We're looking at things like corporate sustainability reports, filings that they need to do quarterly and annually, being a public company, things of that nature to bring to market just underlying information, high quality, reliable underlying information that then firms could layer in an opinion upon. Bank of America is using our data, for example, to create their ESG meter, which they've now rolled out to 3 different sectors, with more sectors to come. And we're in the process of rolling this data set out globally. Since you mentioned that I have the privilege of standing in our affiliate New York Stock Exchange's presence, this data set is something that the New York Stock Exchange is making available to their public company ecosystem, allowing those companies to look at, well, here's what the ESG footprint you've put out to the market. Is that right? Is that not right? Here's how each of these elements compare against your peer group, things of that nature, which at the end of the day we think is going to lead to better disclosures and more informed disclosures by the companies.
Well, and I got to go back to the floor of the exchange behind you since we brought it up again, and the wonderful work that your team has done, and having the Nest Summit highlighted up there really makes us all so happy. So I have to give a shout out there midstream, Lynn. But, you know, when you talk about the data sets, the things that ICE is doing, and you look at some of the rating systems that are out there currently, what's the big differentiator? How are you achieving that, what you're doing?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And when we were looking at going to market, we didn't want to come out with, yet another rating, which would be an opinion. We're more focused on not providing an opinion to the market. We're most focused on providing that underlying high-level, detailed, granular, accurate, timely information that's understandable by firms. When we were coming out with our ESG data offering, I actually spent and continue to spend quite a bit of time with our head of sustainability at ICE, really understanding what her pressure points were, alongside asset owners, asset managers, banks, to understand what their pressure points were in the market and why there was such a variety of opinions based on the ratings in the market. And it all came down to the one consistent answer, which was the underlying data had problems. There was no one really collecting that underlying data and checking it for accuracy with timely updates, allowing a robust querying process. And these are things that we just do in our normal day-to-day, so we have a ton of experience in. It's really what led us to roll out the offering that I just mentioned on the reference data side earlier this year.
Well, it brings to mind the old adage, garbage in, garbage out. If you have bad, unstructured, faulted data, the outcome can't possibly be good, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Lynn, as we close out here, ESG continues to evolve, iterates, gets more scale. Any other innovations that you want to tell us about from ICE, things you're excited about?
Yeah, I mean, I already touched on our climate risk, which we're super excited about, again, starting with municipalities, our ESG reference data. But quite honestly, I think this is a space that is rapidly evolving. The reason I think that is, for the first time earlier this year, in the height of volatility, you saw that ESG data was an alpha generator. There has been a variety of opinions out there prior that ESG data, was it an alpha generator, was it not an alpha generator? And in the first quarter of this year, you saw traditional equity funds have outflows of more than 30%, while ESG benchmarked funds had inflows during that same period. You see the performance of those funds very much varying. The traditional equity funds had poor performance. The ESG equity funds had quite good performance. And Bank of America had just put out a recent research study saying the E in ESG, the environmentals, the climate risk, those types of things, the companies that scored best in that category in particular really drove that outperformance. So I think this is a space that is now going to even further accelerate now that the market understands that these metrics can be used for alpha generation, particularly in times of stress. Aside from our base data offerings, indices are a very, very important part of the growth of passive funds and gaining in popularity on the ESG side. We now have about 50 ESG fixed income indices. We have a full suite of carbon indices, which we brought live to coincide with Earth Day earlier this year, which measure global carbon markets as well as regional carbon markets and emissions on a real-time basis. So we're super excited about that. But I wish I had a crystal ball, because I think this world is going to continue to evolve for many years to come.
Well, couldn't agree with you more on that, Lynn. The signals are so strong for ESG. What you're doing at ICE and bringing the analytics, the data, tool packages for alpha capture and creation, just extraordinary. Wanted to thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for the support from ICE, NYSE, for the Nest Summit, and of course, Climate Week, New York City.
Everyone, my name is KAVITA Gupta. Welcome to Nest Summit for Climate Week 2020. I'm so excited today because we are finally talking about women leadership in climate activism. You know, since Greta has become a poster child, we all are talking about girls and women, but how many other women can you quickly think who are the leaders, who are really movers and shakers in the climate space? Thinking hard? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today. There is a little video which is going to connect you to the powerful message from women across the world.
When I was young, I fell in love with this world.
I fell in love with the silence of the desert,
the smell of the earth after rain,
the plains of South Dakota. I fell in love with the way that the world holds us.
I am a climate scientist.
I am a Palestinian Texan.
An all-around general nerd.
I am an immigrant.
An advocate. I'm a leader.
I am a black girl from the hood who's trying to change climate policy.
When I look around today,
I see a lot of brokenness,
corruption, divisions between the haves and the have-nots,
living systems of the planet fraying.
And I feel worried about our future.
I feel grief.
I feel ashamed.
Really angry.
Heartbroken.
Numb. On good days, I feel courageous.
To me, the climate crisis
is an economic issue.
It's an immigration issue.
Spiritual issue.
A feminist issue.
A right now issue.
It's the ultimate intersectional justice issue.
I'm determined to be part of the solution because I want there to be children on this planet in 7 generations.
Because everyone has a role to play.
Because it's the right thing to do.
It's easy to imagine a future that is bleak.
I can also imagine transformation.
People rising in resilience.
100% clean energy.
Farms that sequester carbon in their soil.
A world that is inclusive.
A future that works for all of us.
I am a woman.
I'm a woman.
I am leading on climate.
We are leading on climate.
Join us.
Join us.
And now we have some amazing women joining us from all over the world. But first and foremost, the person I will be talking to now is someone who is my ideal, someone I follow, and someone I really, really look up to. I don't even know where to start her introduction. A businesswoman, a producer, journalist, activist. Pat Mitchell is the chair of the Women's Media Center, Sundance Institute, V-Day, Green Cross International, George Foster Peabody Awards, Acumen Fund, Skoll Fund, and I can keep on going for 30 minutes. But why don't we just have Pat and talk to her about the amazing journey in life and how she's using her platform to support all of us. Hey, Pat, I'm so excited to have you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good morning. It's a real privilege to be with you here. Thanks so much.
Pat, you have been the first women CEO of PBS. You curate and host TED Women. You have been using your platform to promote women across sectors. How did the climate justice movement started for you?
My journey into climate activism started really as a child, KAVITA. I was raised on a small farm in South Georgia, and I got the connection very early on between good climate and good crops, and the connection between the climate emergency starting even then and the food we had to eat. Many years later in my media career, I got the real indoctrination into climate and especially climate justice in working with the environmental pioneer, Ted Turner. Ted allowed me and worked with me to produce hundreds of hours of documentaries in the 90s. We're talking about the early 90s.
Wow.
On conservation, natural resource depletion, access to clean water, all the big issues, working on oceans with Jacques Cousteau and National Geographic. So I married into climate too, in that Ted's daughter, Laura Turner Seidel, a globally respected women climate leader, is my daughter-in-law. And my husband's a committed environmentalist, so we sort of live and breathe climate every day. But it wasn't until I started to make the connection between the fact that women are the most adversely impacted community of people who feel the effects and the consequences of climate change and climate crisis, and that women are also the architects of the solutions and going forward shaping a different response to climate, one that finds solutions that are just. So climate justice as a concept was introduced to me through Mary Robinson, the former president of Ireland and the former UN climate envoy. Mary brought it to a group of connected women leaders, another group of women I'm privileged to work with, a cohort of women who lead across all sectors but are not climate activists necessarily. But Mary told us on this gathering, we are all climate activists, and we all bring our own individual issues and the intersectionality of all those issues and put forward then solutions that are just and sustainable.
Wow. How was it different between 90s and what you see today? You know, I mean, this is like very early activism when we still had a much bigger potential to save the earth than what we have today. I mean, look at the fires in California, what's happening in Iceland and Nordic regions with glacier. How do you see this whole thing in the last 20, 30 years?
You know, 30 years ago, no one had ever actually said the term climate or global warming. But we did documentaries on global warming in 1993 and 4. Ted Turner was not only a media visionary, he also saw the impact of climate worldwide, in particular on the most vulnerable communities. And of course, it was happening then. It's just that there wasn't a lot of press and there was very little coverage, very few films made. Now, the difference is we are talking about it like this. There are books being written that we're going to talk about later in this program. There's leadership all over the world as the world now realizes we're in an existential threat. We have very few years left to solve this crisis. We can't sit back. We have to all step in to climate activism and be engaged.
Wow. This looks like decades and decades of journey, basically really just being an activist. During all this time, if you must name top 5 women whose contribution to climate change has been indispensable, who would that be and why?
Now that is a challenging question because I could talk endlessly about the women I've met all over the world who have made climate their main focus, or whatever their focus is, they work on climate. But let's just start with Christiana Figueres, who led the world toward a global agreement in Paris. It was Christiana's persistent optimism coming out of the failure in the Copenhagen conference that she was determined to get the world to a global agreement on climate. And she did, with the help of a lot of other women, too many to numerous. They did all the behind the scenes negotiating that kept that negotiation moving forward when it could have broken down so many times. Speaking at that conference is a climate woman leader I admire tremendously, Hindu Ibrahim. Hindu comes from Chad, and she brought the indigenous voices forward at the Paris Agreement, and as a climate envoy for the UN, she continues to put the issue of indigenous people on the front burner, as does Takata Iron Eyes and Shea Batista, who I must mention as the 16 and 18-year-old climate activists who are leading the climate strikes and who have brought a whole generation of people into this struggle. And there are many, many more, including the two extraordinary women that are going to join us now, who have recognized that in every community, the ones especially most marginalized and vulnerable, there are women leaders, from presidents of countries to women in regional and remote communities, who are stepping forward saying, we are the victims of the consequences of climate change. We must be the ones who shape the solutions, and women are leading the solutions everywhere.
Oh, I absolutely agree, and thank you for sharing those names. Like, those names are shaping the way we are looking at activism today, and how we're going to actually create some sort of strategies outside of it. You talked about the book, and I know that's what's coming up, but I also wanted to quickly touch base upon your amazing book, which you launched last year, Becoming a Dangerous Woman, Embracing Risk to Change the World. I love that book. I read it cover to cover. When you connect the same feeling and the same sentiments to the climate space, you know, and you met these two amazing women. We would be meeting Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson and Dr. Catherine K. Wilkinson. What inspired you to support them, to help them to actually come up with this book? How did you meet them, and how did you feel like, okay, this is something I really want to be part of?
Well, I can't wait to have them join us and talk to us about All We Can Save, their book. But if I just might reference why my book became a book of dangerous women, it's another climate activist who I want to be sure and mention, Jane Fonda, who at 82, you know, is still on the front lines of a climate emergency. And it was Jane who said to me, we're living in dangerous times. And I said back, in those times, dangerous times call for dangerous women, women willing to take the risk and assume the responsibility for solving the biggest global threats. And certainly that is what Ayanna and Catherine and their work as climate scientists and their work with emerging leaders, that's the work that they lead, and that's the work that will lead us to just and sustainable solutions.
Well, that has already looped us into an amazing book, and we are very, very privileged to have these two amazing rocking women joining us. Their book, All We Can Save, Truth, Courage, and Solutions for Climate Crisis. Very, very excited to have Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson. She's a marine biologist, policy expert, writer, founder and CEO of Ocean Collective. Dr. Catherine K. Wilkinson is an author, strategist, teacher from Atlanta, and was named one of the 15 women who will save the world by Time magazine. Ayanna and Catherine, it's such a pleasure having you guys. How are you guys doing?
Great, thanks for having us.
Now I have Pat, I have Ayanna, I have Catherine. I mean, I have really amazing, badass women on this panel. And I think I just, since I have read Pat's book, I have just said, like, dangerous women is what I want to be. And these three amazing, dangerous women out here, I'm just thinking, what's left on climate crisis now? How can we handle all of this together? Ayanna and Catherine, how did you two meet, and what inspired you to start this journey?
Do you want to start, Ayanna, or do you want me to? I love that
question.
Yeah.
Why don't you kick us off?
So of all places to meet, Ayana and I actually met in the Wild West of Twitter, and then with some very helpful matchmaking by another woman leader in climate, we connected by phone and were sort of off to the races when we discovered our shared commitment to climate solutions and also building community among women who are really leading and lighting the way in this movement.
Wow. And how did you guys connect with Pat? What was the story there?
Pat and I are actually neighbors in Atlanta, but if you can believe it, we met in Oxford. We had to find our way to another continent to meet. And Pat was gracious enough to extend an invitation for me to speak at TED Women a couple of years ago. So we really got to know each other well working on that talk together.
Wow. I mean, I have seen Pat's Women's Network, and believe me, that has been one of the most connected network of women who each and every one of them are so inspiring. So I would love to know more about the book. I haven't got the chance to read it yet, but I know it's coming out. When is it releasing? When is it going to be available?
Yeah. The publication date is September 22nd. It's already available for pre-order. And we can't wait to get this into as many hands and hearts and minds as we possibly can, because it is just overflowing with beautiful wisdom. It's, you know, scientists and policymakers and farmers, and I'm really sorry, my chickens are outside making a lot of noise right now. And all of this diverse wisdom, from like regenerative farming, which is happening outside my window, to thinking about the Green New Deal and what are the stories we need to tell, and our electricity system, and the role of art and design and culture change and the importance of narrative and journalism, and to have all of that wisdom in one book, including wisdom from Indigenous leaders as well, is just, it feels like an amazing gift to be able to offer the world in this moment when we're really, we're needing more leadership. As Catherine says, the climate crisis is a leadership crisis. That's what got us into this mess, is obviously we haven't had the right leaders. And so we were very excited to have this opportunity to shine a light on dozens of women who are leading on climate, who should all be household names and fully supported and fully funded, because their work is truly transformational. And so that is the vision of All We Can Save, is to shine a light on all the brilliance that we have and make sure that women are not left out of these solutions, because they're already leading on them, and they're not going to stop doing that work to write their own books mostly, but we thought we could sort of bring the book to them in the sense of creating and co-editing this anthology. Yeah.
Yeah, and it would be a very, it's an inspirational book, right? Because like in your day-to-day world, you don't even know how many amazing women are really creating such amazing journeys. How did you meet these women, and like what made you decide these are the women we want to get the story? Like, what has been the process like?
I think the best metaphor is something like quilting, because there is this incredibly rich and diverse community of women working on this, working to move climate solutions forward, working to amplify the needs of climate justice and the stories, the policies, the technologies. So really, the biggest challenge for us was trying to get to a subset of this incredibly rich community of women who are leading. So we thought a lot about different topics, different geographies, different ages, racial backgrounds, academic backgrounds, really the whole kind of the whole gamut of different lenses of the kaleidoscope, so to speak, that people are bringing with them in their work. Many of these women, either Ayanna or I, or both of us, had a chance to work with at one point or another. And some we actually really got to know through the process of editing the book, which is really sort of a silver lining that I think we hadn't totally anticipated, kind of the depth of relationship building in the process of bringing the book into the world.
I was just going to add to what Catherine was saying. I mean, we signed a book contract for, 65,000 words and around 20 essays, and it was just impossible to limit ourselves to that. And so it grew because we also wanted to be showing the full spectrum of climate solutions that there are out there and all of the ways that you can participate. This is not about simply marching and donating and voting, although we should certainly be doing all of those things. It's about finding how your special skills can contribute to the climate solutions that we have. And so we wanted to show the full spectrum of work that's being done. And so sort of 20 essays became 25, became 30, became 38, became 41. And our editor was like, you're done. And so it's 41 essays, 17 poems, all these incredibly poignant quotes and original illustrations. And the book, as Catherine was describing, really is this quilt or this mosaic showing all the varied and beautiful and textured ways of contributing to this work.
Wow. Pat, has you? Yes, please.
Would you mind if I just added something that I love that Catherine and Ayanna describe this process as sort of quilting, because in many ways this work in climate has been about women coming together from different perspectives, deeply listening to each other, learning, and then on their shared experiences building something. Catherine and I were privileged to be a part of this cohort of women leaders who are not climate activists, who don't write, who are not scientists, but who in one day said, let's come up with the Declaration for Climate Justice. And in that declaration, just put some principles forward that we can all agree on. And to see everyone listening to each other and hearing what it was like in their community, which is why this book, which will point us to all the many different ways that the climate emergency comes into our lives and is a part of our lives, and our responsibilities to save, to respond, is why I am so deeply excited about the introduction that Catherine and Ayanna are giving us to a very, very broad journey in to the work.
Yeah. Wow. And I want to just jump onto that also, because I think you've said it so well, Pat. We want this book to be, of course, a resource for folks who have been in the climate space for a long time. But maybe more than anything, we want it to be an invitation to those who have been interested, worried, maybe grieving, angry, but to some degree on the sidelines because they haven't felt welcomed in to the climate movement before. And we sort of see all of the different essays and the poems as doorways, sort of showing one way into the work. Ayanna often says we need the biggest and strongest team possible because this is the biggest challenge we've ever faced. So let's invite folks to really bring their superpowers into this movement, whatever those superpowers are. We need them.
Wow. So, Pat, you have read the book, right?
I've read excerpts from the book because I know some of the women who are contributors, so I'm familiar with some of the work. But I can't wait because these leaders, that is such a way of describing where we need to be now, Catherine. We need to be at that place where the doors are all open, where the invitation is to everyone. Come join us on this journey. None of us have the answer, although Catherine came close with Drawdown to a lot of really good answers. But we don't. We're all still looking for the right, just, and sustainable answers. We can't do it alone. For me, that's really the call to action here, is this movement, solving this crisis, this global threat, is for all of us to do together. And this book points us in ways that we can do that.
So just from the excerpts, and for all three of you, if you have to name one woman who has been in this book, which really, really stood out for you. And I know it's a tricky question. It's the most difficult question, asking a parent to select one child. but if it has to be one woman you really, really want to talk about and underline the message, who would it be and what would be the message?
So for me, I felt incredibly honored that we were able to include an essay, an original essay in this collection by Sherry Mitchell, who published a book a couple of years ago that had an enormous influence on me called Sacred Instructions. And Sherry is one of these remarkable people who wears so many hats. She's a lawyer and a teacher, and she works on Indigenous land rights issues. She is from Maine, and Sherry just brings this incredible depth of wisdom that is, frankly, deeply unusual. And there's a part of her essay that Ayanna and I both really love, where she talks about two concepts in her community, Mama Bezu and Alabezu, which mean paying attention to every individual person having enough to thrive and live their lives, and also paying attention to everyone having enough, and not just human beings, but all beings that we share this community of our planet with. So I'm really excited for a lot more people to get to know Sherry and learn from her in All We Can Save.
Sort of my answer to this question changes depending on the moment when I'm asked. So, because I love them all for different reasons, but in this particular moment, the one that's coming to mind for me is actually the final essay in the book, the last one, which is written by Christine Nieves Rodriguez, who lived through Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. Her community was totally devastated. And, out of those ruins and downed trees, I mean, she describes it as like there was not one leaf left after the storm had passed. And help did not come from the government, and they had to figure out what to do. And her essay is titled "Community is Our Best Chance." I think that's right. Mm-hmm. Community is our best chance. And that is one of the core themes of the book, that this is not a book about individual heroes. This is a book about what is possible together. And in community and in expanding circles of community, and obviously expanding levels of government as well. And her essay of how her community came together and everyone contributed whatever they had, and they have built a way to be resilient to future storms. They have built a way to support each other, and to figure out what it might look like to thrive in this world where the climate has very much already changed. And my personal mantra is to build community around solutions, and climate solutions in particular. And so I was just so glad that we were able to include her essay and her story, because I think we often imagine climate solutions as either, requiring a lot of technology or requiring massive government intervention, but there's so much we can do to prepare at the community level to restore ecosystems locally, to transition to renewable energy at a local level. And her essay just pulls all of those threads together in such an incredible way.
Wow. That's really inspirational. Like, now you built it up so beautifully. I'm just so looking forward to reading the story. Pat, for you?
With all due respect to the individual women climate leaders everywhere who have given us the message clearly, it is all of our individual responsibilities to be engaged. I have to go with Ayanna's thoughts here, because we can't solve this, no one individual. And it will be, in my opinion, and so this is where I place my trust, the global community of women who will step forward and who will together find the solutions to this and many other crises.
Yeah. So there are so many solutions offered.
And that's something that's echoed in.
Go ahead, Ayana, please go ahead.
I just wanted to add that, you know, what Pat just said is echoed in the title. We had such a hard time figuring out how we could possibly put a name to this diverse and many-faceted collection. And the inspiration came from a stanza of this Adrienne Rich poem called Natural Resources, which Catherine could probably quote off the top of her head for us. But if you think about the 4 words, all we can save, you know, each of those words is so meaningful, right? And we can no longer save it all. So much has already been lost, but who are we to give up on the rest, right? This is not over yet. And so that is sort of the energy that we wanted to bring to the book. And the we is really important in that title, just as much as the save.
Yeah.
Yep.
And I will quote it because we love it so much. And it's the epigraph of the book. And the closing stanza of that poem is, "My heart is moved by all I cannot save. So much has been destroyed. I have to cast my lot with those who age after age, perversely, with no extraordinary power, reconstitute the world." And there's another line of Adrienne Rich's that we use at the closing of the book, which is that there must be those among whom we can sit down and weep and still be counted as warriors. And that's really the kind of kindred circle that Ayana and I want to help build in the world. It's the kind of kindred circle Pat builds, and I have been lucky enough to be a part of. And to that end, we really wanted the book not just to be a reflection of community, but a catalyst for more community building. So we've designed what we're calling All We Can Save circles, which will kick off the week of October 5th. So small groups, self-organized, who want to get together virtually or socially distanced and make their way through the wisdom of the book over 10 weeks this fall. We know how hungry people are for more generous dialogue about the climate crisis and what we can do, and who are also really hungry for connection. And we have to build that relational web as strongly as we possibly can, just as Christine's essay suggests. It's our best chance.
Wow. So September 22nd, during Climate Week, we are exactly on the time to have the book. And October 5th, you said, right, for the circle. That is what I'm super excited about, because I definitely want to join that circle. And so for all the amazing women out there, whether you think you are a climate activist, you don't think you are a climate activist, October 5th, and that circle can help you to find your other women soulmates in the same space. Before we go to an amazing poem from the book, and we are very, very excited to have the poet actually reciting her work. My last question, this is such a tricky time. It's an election year time. It's going to redefine, it's just how, especially for climate, how things are going to move forward. Do you guys have any call for action individually which you want to underline or want to pass it as your last thought?
I guess I would say, you know, Catherine and I really sprinted to finish this book before the election. We started curating the essays after Christmas, at the end of December. You know, we submitted the draft in April and then did revisions for a few months, and now the book is coming out. It's been a 9-month cycle to birth this collection. And we wanted to make sure that it came out before the election, because this could not be a more important election for climate in the United States when we think about climate policy, certainly at the federal level, but all the way down to, city councils and other local positions. And so to the extent that this book can contribute to that discourse around what it means to be, as Kate Knuth says in her essay in our book, a climate citizen, and really take your role as both a citizen and someone who is contributing to climate solutions seriously at the same time. I've been embracing the hashtag Vote Climate because I feel like that is something that people aren't thinking about enough, is what is at stake for the future of climate policy at all levels of government in the United States in this election. So that's another way in which this book, I think, really meets this moment.
Yeah, and I think we should have Pat's bracelet a little higher, which is all about vote. Just vote.
Right. I would just like to add to that climate citizen is what we all really must be. And to quote Mary Robinson, she always says about climate activism and climate justice, make it personal. Do something every day, and especially vote, that makes it personal. But also the one thing that I believe All We Can Save and the work of these two extraordinary women and all the other climate leaders point us to the opportunity we have as women to envision a very different kind of future and move towards it strategically and, most importantly, together. We can't be dangerous from the sidelines, but we can solve this together.
Voting this year is about so much more than one election cycle, so much more than one term in the White House or one term in Senate or in Congress. This is really a moment because of the crossroads that we are sitting at, truly a crossroads of peril and possibility. We really have to think about voting not just for our own lives, which are certainly at stake here, but for future generations. This is a moment to vote, bringing the spirit of wanting to be a good ancestor to the ballot box. And I'll also just share as we close that we are really excited to carry this work forward with the All We Can Save project, which is launching the same day as the book, September 22nd, which will be a home for this work of community building, engagement, education, and ultimately, we hope, an award for women climate leaders to fund them at the level that they need to do their most powerful work in the world. Too much good work is happening as a side hustle, and it's time for that work to be center stage. And that takes resources, and Ayanna and I are deeply committed to making those resources more available to more women in the space.
Wow. Thank you so much, each one of you. You guys are such powerful women, and actually, apart from being just yourself such an inspiring stories, bringing more and more amazing women at the front line. So I personally, and for Climate Week, thank you so much for doing such an amazing work. And we would be going and hearing one of the poems from the book, Being Human, but I wanted to thank you so much before we move to Naima. Thank you, Pat. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Ayanna, so much. September 22nd, I'm looking forward to the book. This was such an amazing, inspiring conversation. And just to continue before we go, I have amazing Naima Penniman. Naima is a multidimensional artist, activist, healer, grower, and educator committed to planetary health and community resilience. She's the program director at Soul Fire Farm. She has written a poem, Being Human, which she will be reciting for us. And you can read that poem in the book releasing on September 22nd. Thank you. Over to you, Naima.
I wonder if the sun debates dawn some mornings, not wanting to rise out of bed from under that down feather horizon. If the sky grows tired of being everywhere at once, adapting to the mood swings of the weather. If clouds drift off, trying to hold themselves together, make deals with gravity to loiter a little longer. I wonder if rain is scared of falling, if she has trouble letting go, if snowflakes get sick of being perfect all the time, each one trying to be, one of a kind. I wonder if stars wish upon themselves before they die, if they need to teach their young how to shine. I wonder if shadows long to just for once feel the sun. If they get lost in the shuffle, not knowing where they're from, I wonder if sunrise and sunset respect each other, even though they've never met. If storms have regrets, if volcanoes get stressed, if compost believes in life after death. I wonder if breath ever thinks of suicide, if the wind just wants to sit still sometimes and watch the world pass him by, if smoke was born knowing how to rise, if rainbows get shy backstage, not sure if their colors match right. I wonder if lightning needs an alarm clock to know when to crack, if rivers ever stop and think of turning back, if streams meet the wrong sea and their whole lives run off track. I wonder if the snow wants to be black, if the soil thinks she's too dark, if butterflies want to cover up their marks, if rocks are self-conscious of their weight, if mountains are insecure of their strength. I wonder if waves get discouraged, crawling up the sand, only to be pulled back again to where they began, if land feels stepped upon, if sand feels insignificant, if trees need to question their lovers to know where they stand, if branches waver at the crossroads unsure of which way to grow, if leaves understand they're replaceable and they still dance when the wind blows. I wonder where the moon goes when she is in hiding. I want to find her there and watch the ocean spin from a distance, listen to her stir in her sleep. Effort give way to existence.